Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us for this conversation on digital government in 2030, seamless, proactive, and trusted. It's the moment where we get to step away from the detail of the context of the current moment and do a bit of dreaming and envisioning to envisage a brighter future for citizens by 2030. We all know that future gazing is a bit of a risky endeavor. It's 2022 and we still don't have flying cars, but we do have mRNA vaccines, hydrogen fuel cells, e-scooters. So 2030 is not that long away, so I hope we can do a reasonably detailed job of thinking about what we might be able to, working in partnership between private sector and government, offer to citizens by then. So to do that, we have a panel of experts who each have direct experience of developing products and services for citizens on behalf of governments. We have Nicola Villa, Executive Vice President of Mastercard for Strategic Growth. We have Paul Maltby, the outgoing CDO of the UK's Department for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities. And we have Christine Bellamy, who's Director of gov.uk, which is the website of the British government, owned by the Government Digital Service. Great to be here with you guys. I would like to open us up by asking each of you to say what in the specific area where you're working would you like to be able to deliver for citizens by 2030? Nicola, maybe you could start us off.
Yes, well, thank you for the question. It's great to be here, and thanks to the Friends of Public for hosting us. Now, first of all, what 2030 will look like means to me that to look at the future, we need to basically go and look at the past, what happens in the last, especially 3 years, right? And to me, in the past 3 years, we've seen a bit of a glimpse of what 2030 will look like. In many ways, if you look at the way we build our business, we partner with governments in the public finance management perspective, which also means enabling digital payments, disbursements, and collections in and out of government. We also partner on the data side, so during the pandemic, for example, in the tourist space, more than 120 agencies reached out to us to try to understand what was happening to the tourist sector, which corridors were opening and closing and so on. And that's we also work in the cybersecurity, in the fraud management perspective, looking at basically our network and our data. And so we've seen what the future might look like in a number of ways. First of all, we saw the compacting and the shortening of the program implementation cycles in government with the support of the private sector. It used to take us 2.5 to 3 years to set up a large disbursement program. We are actually running with Comerica Bank Direct Express, which is the world's largest disbursement program. And it takes 3.5 years to set this up. Now, in the pandemic, we had to set up something similar in 3 to 4 months. Right? So we started to learn how the public sector and the private sector could come together. We started to learn much better how we could use each other's assets, capabilities, infrastructure, and services, and quickly deploy services that will need to basically go and literally save lives of people or allow thousands of small and medium enterprises to stay alive. The second thing that we've seen, which is a bit what I love to be able to see in the future, is a better usage of data. We saw how data became, or the need to have real-time data or near real-time data became much more impelling and compelling and important in the pandemic. We saw a few agencies that started to understand how, while digitizing payments, they will be able to stop blanketing disbursements to an entire economic sector in the SME space and understand which were the most impacted layers in the SME side, what segments were more impacted. Some of them started to even test and learn. If I disburse in such a way to these SMEs, am I actually getting a benefit quicker out than I will do in a normal way? And so we saw data becoming basically a feedback loop that we didn't imagine 2 years ago could take place. And maybe the last point is we saw actually trust, which has been one of the issues, and we speak about this later on, the barrier basically low down. And I've been in this business for the last 25 years. So I worked before Mastercard, for Cisco, for IBM. And that trust between the public and the private sector has always been a challenge. The languages that we spoke were different. The culture was different. The way we were looking to programs and projects and timelines were different. I think in the last couple of years, we came together in a much more efficient way. And I think the trust barrier went a bit down. We were basically sharing more infrastructure programs. We had fintech and tech companies coming in and solving for those issues on top of the infrastructure that we deployed. But I think the collaboration started to accelerate in an unprecedented way. And I wish in 2030 we will be still in a similar situation.
Great. So not only can we deliver faster payments, but we should be able to learn from a policy perspective from how effective payments have been at getting the policy outcome we want by having much better insights into data. Great. My sort of ex-civil servant brain is just whizzing and aching at the thought that perhaps the data is going to be too fast for policy to keep up.
Yeah.
The barriers to experimenting with new kinds of intervention might be more cultural than technical, but we can perhaps get onto that. Paul, tell us what you would like to see in place by 2030, and you're about to leave your current post, so you're possibly leaving a massive to-do list for your successor here.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking it's sort of a reflective mood as I move on from UK government, start a new role at a faculty AI data science company on Monday. But I think I'd start this by thinking about, well, just go 8 years backwards. Notice how far we've all come in that space and time, and some incredible stories through today, but we've all got those, you'll be sitting there thinking about the examples that you know of in the audience here, that we've got this. When we need to build a new digital service or we're amending other things, we know how to do this in a way that 8 years ago it felt that we were, working with, certainly from the UK context, we were working in a new way. We were trying to change how everyone thought of this, prove our competence. These days we take it for granted that we can run a good digital service and it will work and we'll do it properly. More recently, just things like Homes for Ukraine service in the UK, we span this up, I suppose after COVID practice in a funny way, we were able to spin up these services very quickly. I think to answer the question about 8 years forwards, I think there's a couple of things I would pick out. And one, it's interesting, it's been mentioned a few times today, but thinking more about government as a platform. So the idea is as we develop our services, we do them in a way that expose the data and standards in a way that enables other people to build services on top of that. In a much more expansive way, rather than just thinking about the transactional services that we run in government, we're thinking more about the role of government as a place where we set rules and conduct the space for other people to do things. So in my old team, in the Pot for Levelling Up in the UK, working on planning reforms, and the idea we're improving the way that the land use planning goes in the UK and how the digital services work, but specifically doing that in a way that exposes the data for other people in the housing and land and planning sectors that might have nothing to do with public services, but in a way that can help the productivity in those sectors over the medium term. And I think we don't hear as much about that as we should do at this point in time, and I think we'll hear more. And the second thing points more towards, I guess, my new job rather than the old job. So it's really around machine learning and data science. And, not new things actually, of course, have changed the dynamics of how we all work and live and are entertained these days. But in the government context, I think we're starting to realize now at scale, partly because of COVID, the exactly ways that Nick just said about you can bring forward data in ways that you weren't able to do from other sources, presented and use that for insight. There's still a lot of road in that space, I think, globally. But I also think about using that machine learning experience within services rather than just yet another dashboard to help make fundamental decisions on, which is fine. But actually bringing that within to the services themselves, I think that's a really big and exciting space. And I think by 2030, I would love to see that more routinely, that degree of machine learning for automation, for those sort of routine tasks, more routinely just a normal matter of course thing that happens within our services, making them more efficient.
More and more significant use of AI to make decisions in policymaking could be inflammatory in some quarters, but I completely agree with you that it must be the way forward if we want to get more efficient and we want to be able to maximize the power of that technology.
And so if I may, I think the AI for decision making, sometimes it's like, actually there's a lot of road before we get to that point. Just the routine, boring things of government. So often in government we have human teams, do the equivalent of stamping the thing, not literally, although sometimes. And much of that work about compliance and what is going on, is this thing true? Where is all the things? Those can be done, I think, much more at the administrative level, much more routinely through application of those tools without having to get into, are the robots deciding what the tax rate should be or something like that.
Yeah, as someone who's spent a week of my time opening and re-enveloping visa applications when I worked for the Foreign Office, I can tell you there are still quite a lot of actual rubber stamps and actual paper jobs going on in government. Christine, tell us about your ambitions for 2030.
Yeah, I'm going to just take a little bit of a different tack, definitely building on what's been said already. But I think there's that phrase of government for all, which I don't think we've realised. And I'd like to be optimistic and say that 2030 is a good timeline to start thinking about that. And what does that mean? I think even now, though we've come so far, there are massive parts of populations that don't have a good service from government. I mean, my role is to work for Gov.uk, which is the audience-facing product for government. And although we've done some brilliant things in its 10-year history, consolidating government, and that's been fantastic, and making sure that we've got user content design that really drives outcomes. When we really look at the data, there's big parts of it that we're just not reaching audiences that we should reach. And I think if we get some of these decisions right, and we make good decisions about the use of data, for that end user, it should just be seamless. It should just feel like they've just turned up and it's like they've just gone on Instagram and it all just works, but they're dealing with the government. So it just feels like that's possible. And in this timeline, 8 years, it really could happen. So that's where my brain is.
Absolutely, yeah. 8 years is a very long time in technology development. So we've talked a bit about some ambitions and how we might hope to see services evolve by 2030. What do you see as some of the main barriers to us getting there? I don't know, Nicola, if you want to...
Maybe a couple of points on our side. First, I think the main barrier is trust. Trust between the public and the private sector, trust between the citizens, the government, and the citizens and the private sector as well. And as I mentioned before, at least between the public and private sector, I sense the last couple of years brought the trust barrier a bit down. We are much more keen, we are much more able to leverage on each other assets, or build through public-private partnership, because we had to do it. We were in a sort of pressure cooker. Assets came together. We had round tables with NGOs, government, fintech, and Mastercard. And I saw, again, conversation that I would never imagine would happen, because we all had to basically deliver something in time to the recipients of a disbursement or any type of aid that we provided. So trust to me is the main issue. Trust also comes through the quality of the service that we're able to provide. Maybe it's a very simple story. I come from a family in Italy of small and medium businesses. And at a certain point, my sister, who runs a small computer shop, had to go online and basically ask for a benefit in the middle of the pandemic. She spent an hour and a half to basically get to the Italian website, which was quickly set up in a matter of a couple of days. And she started to see somebody else's data. Right, so to the point to which Prime Minister Conte had to go on television, national television, and apologize for that specific incident. And I can tell you today, my sister, highly computer literate, has lost the trust. And so to gain it back is going to take a very long time. Right? And she understands technology much better than people that don't. Right? So that trust, gaining trust, the same is between the public sector, the private sector, and the consumers. Right? You have to basically keep it and nurture it. The other barrier that I've seen in my career, hence me actually joining Mastercard 5 years ago after having spent 25 years in the technology sector, is the way we're designing architectures. So for the last 25 years, we always saw the design of architectures. In the 90s, if you think about, e-government was about broadband. We were describing networks, right? Then we saw the emergence of sensors and smart cities, so we started to think about data being generated for that. Data moved from being descriptive into cognitive and everything we have in between. Then we spoke about application, agile development. We put cybersecurity on the side of architecture, and we put blockchain on the other side. We actually never spoke about payments. And if you think about digital payments, they are actually another layer on that stack that we spoke about, which has actually never been considered. And so I've seen many projects in the government space, in the smart city space, where we design the entire environment, and then the payment is completely an afterthought. Everything happens manually 2 weeks after I basically generate a transaction, and I pay in a completely different system. And so the question for us is, how do you bring payments as part of the infrastructure, which helps to transform the experience of the citizens at the moment, in our case, in which they ask for a benefit, and they receive it seamlessly versus basically waiting for 6 months. So that's part of our view on what the two barriers are. One is technical, and the other is actually more human and trust-based.
Yeah, that must be a huge part of it. And just to sort of develop what you said there about kind kind of high-profile failures and how much they damage trust and confidence. You mentioned your sister's experience with a data leak. The Dutch Minister for Digital this morning mentioned child benefit scandal. In the UK, we had the AI-driven exam results kind of scandal, which I think sort of coloured the sort of nature of the debate around tech in public services for quite a long time. And these things are really damaging. And so I wonder, is it understandable if civil servants and ministers and politicians are a bit risk-averse? And is there a way to square that kind of need to be super careful not to damage trust and confidence with the need to experiment and make progress and move fast? One sort of really interesting approach is the announcement the minister made this morning about holding a prize for public failure. And I love that, and I would love to see that done in the UK. But I wonder, how do you see governments being able to reconcile that tension between showing that they are trustworthy and not compromising that, while still being able to take some risks? Paul?
Yeah, so I think it's a well put challenge. I mean, I think when we're thinking about barriers to the types of change that we're talking about, one I would certainly make is that I think for those of us who've been, in the room and responsible for working on public service or civic sector digital services, we still feel quite removed sometimes from the, if you like, the more policy power structures that are still more dominant in the system. And I think I'm sure I'm not alone in being sort of feeling like people think that I'm doing magic of some sorts and not really understanding what's hard and what's easy. Things like, can I send 1 million emails? Yeah, that's no biggie, right? We get that done in the hour. Can I make something else that actually where the technology doesn't even exist? These are questions that are sort of put to us in a way where you think actually that digital literacy you would expect probably to be higher by now. And I think if we are thinking about things we hope for over the next few years, I would hope that I don't know if this is just a UK government thing or maybe a more Anglo-Saxon thing, I don't know. But certainly I would hope that digital services no longer seen as just an operational matter, but that we as a community get right upstream into the core strategic decision-making of public services. Because if you think about the types of digital business models that I'm sure Mastercard and others have wrestled with in waves over the last decade or so, my guess is they've fundamentally changed some of the structures and the working environments and how you think about your business. Well, very often in government, we have not got to that point. We are still working on thinking of digital as dealing with the transactional services that you, a citizen, applies for on the internet to get your thing back. And government is so much more than just a token-giving machine. It's just not, it's a bit of what we do, but it's not even probably the biggest bit of what we do. Yet I still think we're yet to break into that space. So I think it's not just a question of the digital literacy, as I said a minute ago. It's something about the fundamental structures of government to bring the digital folks alongside the strategic policy makers and indeed the political folks to understand that the business models of the modern era are shifting. That means different sorts of responses, different sorts of challenges. And I still think those examples are relatively few and far between that I see globally.
Yeah. Well, that seems a good time to come to you, Christine. You've come into central government relatively recently.
Yeah.
So without wanting to put you in an uncomfortable position,
No,
how have you found that?
I'd sort of build on that, really. I think part of it is because we don't do it enough. So the chances of it going wrong, it is that sort of project versus product thing where we've put so much investment in a thing that is new, and then it goes wrong and it hits the press and everything falls down and we go back 2 steps. I think if you change into that culture of innovation, things will go wrong. I mean, we've all had this last week that WhatsApp went down. I'm sure if you worked at WhatsApp, you were really bothered, but probably as a WhatsApp user, it's a bit of an inconvenience.
Yeah.
So we absolutely have got to be so careful on data share. Of course we have, it's right up there at the list. But we need to also be careful that we lose the sort of ambition to innovate, because to your point, absolutely beautifully made, it isn't that it's an enabler tech, it probably is the solution, you know, so turning it on its head and saying it might be the offer, it might be the thing that people have as a service in the future. But I think that the key to that is not sort of, when it goes wrong, sort of going, okay, it went wrong, move on and try the next thing, instead of sort of going back 2 steps, because we will talk ourselves out of so much that we'll fall behind, and our users, our citizens, they won't forgive us for it in the long run. So I think they would be more forgiving probably if we made some mistakes along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that must be right. And it also occurs to me that we've always made mistakes. It's not that embracing technology is leading us to make more mistakes than necessary than usual. You know, when data didn't exist in the cloud and was on CDs, we used to lose whole CDs worth of people's personal information. You know, yes, Paul.
I think just on that, I think I'm torn. I've been really enjoying the event today, and the description is some sessions of really advanced work that countries are proud of doing and showing things right at the cutting edge, and also a degree of pride in what we sort of termed, when we were doing work with local government in the UK in digital work, of fix the plumbing, like #FixThePlumbing, right? And take a pride in some of the boring things that you need to get done. And I think when we're thinking about the next 8 years, one of the challenges that we have to achieve the world that we all set out in our first comments is that, you know, boy, do we have a long tail of services that are still needing to be sorted out, even in departments, in countries, and in sectors where we are proud of the progress. We've got a long tail, and we've got some hideous, gnarly legacy services that not really on anyone's list to fix, that are getting in the way. But until we get to the point where you have that more interoperable world, where we can just sort out an API to be able to work with that, if we've got some of those crumbly services, sometimes in municipal sectors, somewhere non-central government services, then that is a challenge for us. And we have to do that, fixing the plumbing, alongside the cutting edge work. And I always feel torn between these two areas of, you know, wanting to be right out there, but also knowing that actually, unless we get that boring stuff right, we're always going to be held back. And of course, sometimes a little bit less appetite for doing the less, the less fancy stuff.
Can I add a perspective from the private sector side? So I've been working on the government space for, again, more than 20 years. And many of my colleagues that work in other parts of the business, I can tell you, in every company I work in, look at the government people within corporations, it's a bit strange, right? Because we are a job of translators between the corporate world and the government. We are building those programs and those partnerships, which for the rest of the technology companies are somehow obscure. I'm making a bit of an extreme here, right? We are a bit the boring people, right? Because we work on, again, things like procurement, right? Which is not necessarily sexy. I can tell you, however, over the last 7, 8 years, we have seen a huge surge of interest within those corporations of people that actually want to join the government teams and the government segments because of the pride that you spoke about. So that sense of pride is also in the private sector for people that basically be partnership in government. And because of the idea basically of building an impact, doing boring things maybe, but things that are actually quite meaningful and that transformational. Yep. And that's why you see more and more intersection between the people that we have in the government, in the private sector, largest organizations, with that sense of common purpose and that sense of pride. We see this change, which is extremely evident in all corporate environments.
Yeah.
And do we think as well, also, it's more porous in a way between these sectors? I think very often you think of traditional government, civil service characters, and I think a lot of the people in this community, we have been in and out in different sorts of ways, and we come with a different mindset from perhaps the traditional government machine. Yeah. And I think that's a really healthy thing myself, and something to be celebrated. And I think if we're again thinking about 2030, I would hope you'd see more of those porous edges, actually, in an appropriate way, of course. There should be proper rules about how we move between places and where we can and where we can't. But I think that I would hope that becomes much more normal across the wider public service machine if we're going to have the types of reform that we know that we need and that we're capable of delivering.
Yeah. I think one other barrier, we talked about barriers, is collaboration between private and public sector, between governments themselves. The lovely thing about today is you can see in the bones of this conference that people here have come because that's important to them. And the conversations you see everywhere are people joining up. It's not like a tech conference I've been to before where everyone's just trying to sell you something. This is people trying to come together to do good. And if that's how we thought about collaboration in our workspaces, it would make a big difference because generally we are siloed. And if we can break that silo ever more so, text, again, is an absolute silver gold thread through that if we get that right. But it is a barrier at the moment because so often a department in its own right will think about its own values and think about what it needs to deliver. So anyone who's in that space, anyone in this room, if you think you're a game changer that can lead into collaboration, that could change a lot of things.
Absolutely. I think you've got more chance with this audience than with most of them believing that procurement is sexy. but I wonder, how do you see politicians being able to kind of take more of an interest in fixing the plumbing? What's the kind of, how do you make it real for them, the link between quality services for people and what they can offer to people on doorsteps when they're out campaigning? I don't know, I mean, do you see that as part of your roles? I don't know.
Definitely. I mean, for me, I very much spend time, coming new into the organisation, I've spent time making sure that we are talking directly to government ministers about what the product of Gov.uk can do. The lovely thing is they get that, and we've had some great wins recently where they've been saying that word on TV, etc., which is just fantastic. You couldn't be more proud. But why is that happening? It's because they know that there's a need themselves, and like anybody, if you can create a good argument of why something should be used, and it's sensible, then people make good decisions. So I think for us, as anyone who's in the tech world, needs to make sure that we are good with our language and that we're able to explain ourselves when we talk about return. So they're important. We need to stand up and make sure we can be measured, which is one thing. But then I think in doing so, there's a two-way partnership then with government ministers. Because on their watch, they want to make change, and technology helps that. But you've got to keep that conversation going.
Absolutely. And Nicola, I wondered, as a sort of view from the outside, do you see culture and organisational change going on within governments that, to try and help them adapt to be slightly more agile and slightly more able to absorb new talent and new ideas and champion some of these kind of new tech fixes?
I think talent remains an issue in the sense that one of the challenges that at least we see our government counterpart discussing with us is basically how do we attract talent, right? So talent tends to go from government into the private sector. When we have got many people in Master that come from the public sector, the journey back is always more problematic. There are people, and I know many, who basically say, okay, I've spent 20 years in the private sector, and now I'm going to take my learning and basically reapply them into the government because I want to provide a service. That happens. But I think it's much more seldom than that. I think the younger generation tend to basically take the opposite route. And so the question is, how do we incentivate people to second into the government and vice versa? The mechanisms, to me, are generally not there yet. But also, how do we make sure that those people who are basically keen to provide a service in the government get the right training, the right exposure, and the right opportunity to be able to shine within the organization? So I think that flow is actually too much unilateral versus being bilateral. We should be doing something about it. The other point to me, and again, I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago in a conversation about technology and government, and I think it's policy and regulatory. So one of the conversations that we were having, I think it was at Bruegel, right, which is a famous think tank in Brussels. We spoke about how Europe was falling behind in terms of technology, evolution, and how large, companies will come from the US and from China only. And actually raise a counterpoint. If you think about fintech, Europe has been and is leading in terms of fintech. The number of fintech in Europe is twice as much as the ones of the US and China combined. And my point is always that the European, at least the European, in fact, all the European governments beyond the EU have basically launched open banking programs, creating policy regulatory environment which were inclusive. As an American multinational company, we were involved at the early stages of the policy regulatory, and we were basically allowed to say what we thought, right? It's not always the case in other parts of the technology stack, right? And so that generated an opportunity, for example, for Mastercard to structurally partner with fintech and to make sure that we help create the next unicorns in Europe, because that's good for our business as well, right? So that inclusive policy and regulatory framework, open banking and PSD2 has created an unprecedented opportunity in this continent. And so somehow my view is, should we start thinking about doing the same for the broader technology conversation in Europe from a policy and regulatory perspective? Make it inclusive, make it open, and then the businesses, large and small, will find a way to basically thrive and innovate on top of that.
Absolutely, yeah. We have burned through our time alarmingly rapidly. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to end us on a positive note by asking you what makes you optimistic about how digital government could look by 2030. Christine, do you want to kick us off?
Well, today's part of that, isn't it? You meet people and you realise everybody it really matters. I think we do have some great talent in our teams that choose to come and work with us because they want to work on products and services that make a difference at scale to audiences. I think that's a big win. Coming from the private sector, that wasn't there. So I think that's a gem that could take us forward and could make a real difference. I also think technology's catching up. So the things we wrote in PowerPoint presentations 5 or 6 years ago and told everybody how the world was going to be, it turns out some of that is possible, but it's possible now, not then. So that makes me optimistic.
Absolutely. Nicola?
I echo Christine's words. I mean, I was listening this morning to a couple of conversations, and I was going back to conferences that we had literally 15 years ago, where we discussed exactly the same issues and principles, yet the technology was not there, and it's there today.
Yeah.
Right, so to me, we got a better possibility today to drive change, to rethink about processes, and then to map it into technology that we will have 15 years ago. We were thinking about theories, but the technology, the data, for example, was not there. The other positive factor to me, I touched on, Christine, is the people. The people and the passion in the government, and increasingly in the private sector to work with the government, large and small enterprises is starting to come together. And again, the last 3 years, with the tragedy of COVID and the tragedy of the war and so on, in many ways, crystallized and accelerated the conversation and the passion that people have today.
Yeah, so there can be some good fruits of a crisis.
Catalyzing this type of collaboration and joint investments and developments.
Yeah, and lastly, Paul.
So I think what gives me confidence is we've got this, right? We look at what we're doing today. It's no longer, we can't even list the examples of like interesting, amazing digital services because we've all got loads of them because it's just a routine thing that we do. And I think the competence that we as a digital public service community have got actually at a global level now is frankly awesome. And I think that, in the end, this change is coming for governments as it's come for all the other sectors, and it will eat us in those sorts of ways. So it's coming anyway. And what's amazing is that we have this community that is capable of channeling that and keeping on top of those changes as they happen over the next years that take us to 2030. I feel very confident about that.
Great. Well, I would absolutely echo that. It's certainly been my experience today hearing from all the wonderful panellists and discussants that we've heard. It's given me plenty of food for thought and for optimism for 2030. And I hope you've found this conversation as inspiring as I have. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you. Have a good rest of your day.